So as you can maybe guess, I'm pretty excited about the next speaker. Means a great deal to me. So Cara Thiessen, when she graduated from high school, did as a lot of students do, which is like, how far away from home can I get to study? So she went to BC and she did a certificate in early childhood education, and I believe pretty confidently declared at that point that that was all the school she would ever want to do. So now, when we make those decisions, we don't always stick by them. Quite glad of that. She ended up coming back to the proper coast and finished her psychology degree from SSU. And then did a variety of work related to, well, actually before and after, she did a variety of work related to childcare. So she, ranging from being a nanny in Prague to doing early childhood intervention here in Charlotte County. Decided she wanted even more education after all. And so she went to Concordia University in Montreal, where she has just completed her Master of Arts in Child Studies. And so she'll share a little bit of that with us today.
All right, so as you can see by my title, in true SSU fashion, never leaves you, community comes back. Can't leave that behind. So I decided to take my constant love of children's literature and bring that into my research, and but I needed to make it a more practical thing, because what I did, instead of a thesis option, we had the choice of doing an internship. So while still doing a complete report on the research I was doing, it had more of a practical foundation. So it comes across as more of a case study than a thesis in the end. And so where I went, it was Concordia's observation nursery at the university. So a small group of 6 children is the group that I was working with, but I chose to focus in on 3 children specifically, and I'll get into more details on that once I get into it. So to start, I wanted to explore the concept of narrative, and as narrative has such a wide range, I decided to focus on the social-emotional implications of what narrative can do. So why exactly am I looking at narrative? What can narrative offer in terms of what I wanted to explore? So I came across 4 different things that became evident, looking at certain theorists like Jerome Bruner in particular, who created kind of a psychology of narrative. And so through that, I established these 4 different implications that I wanted to focus on, and then I'll connect them with how they connect with community, in a sense. So first of all, there is an idea of meaning and interpretation. So what does narrative mean to you? Why am I listening to a story? Why am I telling this story? Those kind of questions. And an important aspect of that is the distinction between the listener, or the teller or author, and the listener. So the author of a story can have something really specific in mind to why they're telling the story, why they've written the story. Mm-hmm. They have certain meanings with the characters and the events that happen, but that might not be the same as what the listener is getting from the story. So there's a very different, could be very different interpretations. So looking into those different aspects of it. And then there's the concept of negotiation. And what I connect this with is a few different aspects, but one in terms that came out in Bruner's thoughts is an idea of peacekeeping, so that it's a healthy form of negotiation that can come out of this. And I just wanted to read one of my favorite quotes from Bruner that kind of goes along with this. So he says that in human beings with their astonishing narrative gift, one of the principal forms of peacekeeping, the human gift for presenting, dramatizing, and explicating the mitigating circumstances surrounding conflict, threatening breaches in the ordinariness of life. So he's saying that because narrative offers different points of view and allows expression of emotion and thoughts that can open up communication. So this is a lot of the concept behind the truth and reconciliation committees and things like that. So that's a lot of what goes behind that. So it allows for negotiation to happen instead of a blind sense of your own interpretations of things, your own opinions. And he also really establishes that narrative can't really happen if it is only within the ordinariness of life. So what's ordinary doesn't necessarily make a good narrative. So narrative exists when things go beyond the ordinary as well. And that also leads to the idea of empathy. So because you're getting these different interpretations, different points of view, it's opening up to being able to understand what other people might be, where other people might be coming from. And so in one of the studies I was looking at, and bringing this back to more of early childhood context, so this one study by Zepeda, she was doing a case study in a classroom where there was one girl who had just entered into this classroom. She was new to the country, so she didn't really know a lot of the social dynamics and things like that, and so she would never want to go outside and play. And so she created this story during a group circle time, and she began a story about a girl who never wanted to go outside and play. So then she invited this girl to enter into the narrative and say, why might this girl not want to go outside? And so she allowed this girl to join the narrative and come up with, without being directly being her necessarily, she was able to express, well, maybe that girl didn't have any friends to play with. And so what this happened with, and then she invited the other children to join in coming up with solutions with the narrative. What might this girl do? What might happen in this situation? And so what she says is that she was no longer the girl who always cried at recess, but she was the girl who was sad because she had no friends to play with. So that allowed the other children to kind of understand where she was coming from and why she was not wanting to go outside at recess instead. So empathy comes out. And then there's the idea of self-identity. So you're able to, and again into the early childhood context, and especially with what I'm going to describe in a little bit with my own intervention that I did, is especially if you're dramatizing narratives or things like that, you're able to explore different roles. And so you're able to sometimes go play a character that is completely unlike you. So if you're a quieter, shy child, you're able to take a leadership role, but in a safer context, and explore different dynamics and kind of figure out different characters that you might identify more with, and get more, have chances to explore self-identity in that situation. So why explore narrative within a community context is what I'm going to approach next. So how is there a connection with community and narrative? And so to do that, I am looking back on the tradition of narrative within communities. So you can find in history and very different, in the different disciplines, that narrative tends to transcend time and culture. You see aspects of narrative going to the earliest forms of recorded history, and in multiple cultures around the world, that forms of narrative, maybe not in the same forms, but forms of narrative exist in all these different times and cultures. And so it's because of that it's believed that narrative is something that is intrinsic to humans, and that we're kind of narrative organisms, and that it just is something that's natural with human beings. And but it also, your narrative within your community also is something that kind of identifies you as a community. How you know, if you can hear a certain traditional narrative, you know that it comes from this area. Like there's something that associates with identity. And it's with this that there's an aspect called critical race theory, where in this concept, it's the idea is that within North America, at least in other Western countries, that there's an issue with white supremacy still being a dominant force, and that they've beginning to introduce something called counter storytelling, which is to reintroduce traditional narratives of marginalized cultures. And here at SSU, I believe a year or so ago, there was something called the blanket exercise that was done. And this was started by Cara and adopted by organizations like MCC, where they've created an event that, using different aspects of that are tied in with this culture, they've reintroduced different narratives that belong to these cultures that have been marginalized. And so trying to bring back their identity as a culture. And so that's something that they've been working to do. And what also comes with this is the idea of universal themes. So within narratives, you can see across different cultures, there's different things like fear, or like if you see traditional folktales, they often have like a hero kind of saving the damsel in distress. Like there's different things that come across in multiple cultures and that's why different stories have survived all these years, is that there's something that always connects with the new generation. And so in this way, like there's it's believed that there's like 500 versions of Cinderella in Europe alone. So like there's these survive because there's something about them in the themes of these stories that just resonate no matter what the generation is. And so now I'm going to go into defining what exactly I mean by community. So one of the dominant theories that comes out with communities has been brought out by McMillan and Chavez. And so they describe community as a feeling that members have belonging, a feeling that members matter to one another, to the group, and a shared faith that members' need will be met through their commitment to be together. And so they've, in this definition, they've brought it down to have 4 different elements that if these elements are present in the community and in a healthy way, this is what brings together a community, this is what makes up a community. So I'm going to go through quickly each of these 4 elements because as a form of measurement with my intervention, because I was working with 3-year-olds, a lot of the different measurement tools for community that existed didn't really work in the context that I was in. So what I decided to do was to break it down into these 4 different elements and find evidence of these different elements through my intervention and use that as evidence that community was being formed. So quickly, membership is the idea of belonging, that you've been accepted into this group and that you accept the others within the group as well. So in simple terms, it can be like you're in or you're out kind of idea. And with influence, it's the idea that your ideas are being shared and being accepted, or at least acknowledged, and that you're acknowledging others' ideas as well. And then that's being shared between each other, so that and it has to be bi-directional. It can't just be one way or the other, or else that's where an aspect of the community can start to break down. So if you're dominating your ideas, if you're feeling like your input has to be accepted and embraced at all times, then you might start to get pushed out from the community, or vice versa. If you're feeling like your ideas are not being embraced by the rest of the community, then you might start to break away as well. And then there's the idea of integration and fulfillment of needs. And so that's the idea of sharing each other's skills. And so knowing that you lack a certain skill, so you find someone else in the community that has that skill, you work together to successfully complete your goal. And that you're sharing these, so the idea that you have shared successes because you're working together within your competence, like so that you're offering your skills and that you're using other skills as well in order to actually achieve goals that you and others have set. And then shared emotional connection. And this was I'll get into it later, but this was the most difficult to really measure in my context, partly because it was so short term, that this is something that develops more over time and it's harder to establish right from the get-go. because it involves an idea of shared history, that you have these experiences that you've shared over time, and these have, to be a healthy community, there should be more positive interactions than negative interactions. And an aspect that this has becomes a shared history is also the way that it gets recorded. So this is where art becomes important and stories, written narratives become important, because this is how history is being recorded. So it is what is representing the thoughts and emotions and events that are happening through this history. And so yes, these together is essentially what can bring a healthy community together. Okay, so now I get into the more practical side of it. So to begin my intervention, I needed to decide how was I developing my narrative curriculum. So how was I bringing narrative into the classroom? And so I discovered this author that I discovered her back when I was working in a daycare right before I started even SSU. I went to a demonstration that she did, a workshop, and have been interested in her work ever since. And so she's developed this storytelling, story acting curriculum. So this, I liked it because it involved not only an oral and written narrative, but also dramatizing it as well, which works really well with early childhood as well. Especially because making children's authors, it works, but they're not at the stage that they're actually writing stuff down, so they need a format to express their narratives aside from purely written. And so the way she does it is she has children dictate narratives, like a story, and these are usually really short, simple, 3-4 lines even, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on how comfortable they get with it. And so they come to the educator, and the educator writes it down word for word, what they've said. And then the group comes together, and they act out these narratives that the children have dictated. Usually really simply, the children either request a role or are assigned a role, and they work together to act out their stories. And so here, we're going to try to get a little interactive and see if anyone wants to bring this that they've come up with through my intervention, just so we know exactly what we're working with. They're just really short and simple. So on the first day that we were doing these individual narratives, one boy came up with this story. This one time there was a mean dragon, a little mouse lived in an old broken castle, and there was a little sign, and the little mouse always ate the cheese on toast. The end. So these are all just really short. Really short and simple. Doesn't have to be really complicated. So I thought we would give it a try. So what I thought we would do is just, if anyone had one line to add, and then we can go from there and just maybe do 4 or 5 lines or something like that. So anyone have a starting point? Yes, sir?
The sign was made of the toast with the mouse on the bowl.
Okay. The sign was made of toast. That the mouse had nibbles. Alright, anyone else have a line?
The dragon had bad breath.
Alright, we'll just do one more line. Keep it nice and short. We can continue the dragon. Well, we can see what the dragon might have done. Or we can introduce another character to make it more interesting.
And the bear sang a song. That was an intentional choice.
Alright, so let's see if anyone wants to act like a 3-year-old for a little bit. And as your part comes up, you can enter into the square. So, the sign was made of toast that the mouse nibbled. And the dragon had bad breath. And the bear sang a song. Hey! Different stories to be shared and different roles to be played. And as you can see with the sign, they don't have to necessarily be actual like animals or people characters being played. You can embrace whatever, like at some point when someone was a castle or a cannonball and things like that. So you can play with it however you will. So using this technique, I came up with this intervention. So it went over 4 weeks, had 8 sessions, so there's 2 sessions per week. And the model that I used went over 2 weeks, over 4 sessions, and then the same format was repeated a second time using a different story. So first I introduced a author, like a previously established authored story, and I chose books by Leo Leone. And so I first read the story in normal, typical story time that they're used to. And after reading the story, I had a quick discussion with them about what happened, recounting what happened, what they thought about the events or the characters, things like that. Really short session. And then the next session, we kind of remembered what happened. I brought the book out again, we looked at a few pictures, and they recounted what they remembered about it. And then I used some prompting questions to, and then we acted out this story so that they had read the previous time. And so here they're engaging more with the characters that they had been talking about and introduced to. And okay, and then in the next session, again we recounted the story a little bit, reminded them of what it was, and then using prompting questions, we together as a class they wrote a story about what might have happened with these characters after the book ended. So to continue this narrative, using the context that they had been introduced to already. And then they acted that out again as well. And then in the final session of this format, they, just to warm up, they acted out again the story that they had authored the session before, just as a warm up. And then I invited them to come up with their own individual stories that could be whatever they wanted, and opened it up to expanding beyond the narrative that they had been working with, and then acting those out as well. And so that, in the final session, that's where it's getting more to what Vivian Paley had initially intended it to be. But I didn't want to start with that right from the beginning because this is something entirely new to these children that asking them to come up with a story right off the bat, they might have been a little bit too hesitant. So I intentionally use this as just a kind of slight progression into this format so that they were kind of being introduced to it step by step and warming up to the end goal of them being able to create their own stories as well. So that's what happened. So yeah, there was 6 children essentially involved with this process, but one boy was 2 years old, so he was all over the place. Didn't really work to really record his involvement. And 2 of the children were slightly older. They were 6 years old. They were twins, but they were also francophone. So as much as I invited them into the process, and I would go over the story with them in French separately aside from these sessions, so they could know the story, but they still were hesitant to become involved because they were not quite comfortable with English as well. Even though they had the option of authoring a story in French, but I think they just still had trouble connecting with the whole process. So, as another measurement tool, aside looking at the elements of community, I wanted to see what was happening with the children, like outside of these sessions and as a group. And so I wanted to get a little bit of quantitative data collected as well. So I used something called a play observation scale. And so this, using short interval sessions, so watch a child for 10 seconds, record what type of play they were doing, then move on to the next child and repeat this several times over. And to measure what kind of play these children were engaged in during their free play time. And so this was looking at different forms of play. So there was like whether they were doing solitary play, functional play, group play, or solitary play, group play, or parallel play. And parallel play is if you're playing side by side but not engaging with each other. And then also different types of play, like whether it was dramatic play, if it was exploratory play, so they're just figuring out what toys or materials they were around, or if it was functional play, so that's like if you're just repeating a motion over and over again just to kind of get familiar with something. Or if it was constructive play, like so if you're building a tower or something, that would be constructive play. So the blue is from time 1, so this was done before I started my intervention, and the red was done post-intervention. And so the most significant thing that was found with these results is that there was, if you can see the really large spike in red here from the blue, is the group dramatic play. So there was a significant jump from the pre to the post in their amount of group dramatic play. So from this you can see that they were beginning to develop more collaborative, cooperative play throughout this process. And so here comes the evidence that I found of community. So I'm breaking it down into those 4 elements that I initially introduced. So with membership, one thing I really saw come through was their personal investment into being a member of the class, and this was seen through their level of participation, particularly. So how much they participated in the discussion that we had before starting the enactments, and how much they chose to involve themselves in authoring the stories and acting out the stories. And but this was done in different ways. So the one child, throughout my report, I used just their first initial for confidentiality, but I'm going to give them names just so that it's easier to know who I'm referring to. So one boy of the 3 that I really focused in on, I'm going to call him Ethan. So he was very outgoing, very gung-ho about being involved in this whole process right from the start. He would be the first to raise his hand to answer questions, and you can see that he had an understanding of these narratives fully throughout the process, and becoming increasingly more familiar with this process throughout the sessions. And and he was all like, well, in the first session, with the different roles that were being assigned, so he first wanted to just be like a mouse friend, so something like a group role, so that he wasn't an individual character. So with the mouse friends, there's about 3 different kids, or a couple of different kids, and sometimes the educators were involved in stuff. So there's multiple people playing this character, and he wanted to be one of those. But then, as these sessions went on, he wanted to be central characters as much as he could. He wanted to be the main character. So in the first story that happened, so it was Geraldine and the Music Mouse, he wanted to be Geraldine. And in the second one, it was Tico and the Golden Wings. He wanted to be Tico every time. To the point that I had to say, okay, no, we're going to give someone else a turn in. Instead, he quickly went to the next central character. Another boy, I'm calling him Roy, he was shyer and more hesitant to become involved, and he had trouble coming, so in this center, in this observation nursery, the parents were around. There was an observation room where they could sit, and then they would sometimes go and have conversations with students who were also occasionally coming in to observe. So they were around, and so Roy had trouble separating from his mom and being in the classroom without her, especially at the beginning. And so he started off by wanting to be an observer of this process. So in the first few sessions, he would stand back. So if you see the square, he would be more here instead of actually around where everything else was happening. But very concentrated on what was happening, but still separating himself a little bit. And then slowly, as the sessions went on, he began to accept different roles. At first, with the encouragement of the educator saying, oh, do you want to be this character, those kind of things. And he would occasionally say yes, sometimes say yes, and then back out. And then eventually, in the final session, he played multiple roles throughout that morning. But I still see the observation point as, I still see that as a certain level of personal investment in the group. So he was still intrigued and connected with what was going on, but he was still being a little bit shyer and more hesitant. He was still keeping his distance, but still wanted to be a part of it. And another aspect of membership is the idea of shared symbols, so that you're sharing different concepts together as a group. And what came out with these narratives, in the first story with Geraldine the Music Mouse, it was about a mouse who found a block of cheese and nibbled it away and became this, and these mice had never heard music before. And as she nibbled the cheese, she discovered that it turned into this statue of a mouse who at night music came from it. And she discovered music and then learned how to play music herself. And so from this story, symbols that came out of it were the flute and the cheese. So those they became a part of the authored stories that they came up with, as well as being used within their free play time at other parts of the day. Those came out. And in the second story with Tico and the Golden Wings, about a bird who had no wings, and then a wishing bird granted him a wish, and he asked for golden wings, and he gets golden wings and then gives the gold feathers away because everyone's jealous of him. And so the idea of wings and golden feathers came out. Those symbols were used throughout their narratives and their play as well. And then with influence, there was story overlap. So I really saw this, especially in the final session with their individual narratives, that Ethan first created a story that included a bear, and then every other child's story that came after his included a bear.
And ours.
And apparently ours too. Common character. And so even though that character wasn't a part of the initial story that was a starting point, so at that point they had been focusing on Tico and the Golden Wings, there was no bear in that story, but they took from each other and used their ideas but still made it their own. So like their stories never repeated events, but they still included a bear. So you can see that they're beginning to share each other's ideas a little bit. And there's an aspect of, a part of influence is that there needs to be a certain structure, and that there needs to be leaders and followers. And those dynamics can change and shift, but there needs, at every point in time, there needs to be someone that has a little bit more of a leadership role, and others that have a little bit more of a follower role. And this was seen through the idea that there was some narrative control as they were enacting these stories or as they were authoring stories. So when an individual was authoring a story, if someone else suggested, oh, add this to their story, I always said, okay, do you want to add this? And they could say yes or no. And that was how the dynamics were introduced. And so there was times where these ideas were suggested, and so sometimes their suggestions were taken into account and added into the story, and other times they weren't. And another way this was done was in the roles that they were playing. Sometimes they made a character completely their own. So at one situation in the final session, there was a story that involved a deer, and so it was asked by an educator, Roy, do you want to be the deer? And he's like, I'm going to be a flying deer. So he took that character, but he took some control and brought his ideas into it. And yeah, so then with integration and fulfillment of needs, so there was collaboration happening. They were using each other's skills. So this all happened with co-authoring the stories, with the group stories that were done in the sessions that they were encouraged to continue the stories that had been initially introduced. So they worked together to successfully create a story. And this, as I'll read the stories that they came up with. So in the first story that they were creating together, they came up with this. Their bellies got full, they will dance, their tummies are going to explode, they lost their cheese and can't make more music, they could go bump their heads, and they went to get some musical instruments. So you can see, it is essentially a story, but quite disconnected. And so in the second time around when this happened, they came up with this story. Tico asked the wishing bird to give his friends golden wings. Tico flew to a branch, all the friends flew. Tico and his friends flew to visit Paco and Mimi, and they asked the wishing bird for golden wings too. So you can see that it's slightly more cohesive. Still not entirely, but there's a little bit more connection between the different contributions. So you can see that they're starting to work together and acknowledge each other's contributions a little bit more. And then there's also the role of the educator. So because this is an early childhood context, there needs to be a little bit of support from the educators. So they had a good balance of knowing when to support by saying, oh, that was a good idea, or something like that, or also sometimes if a child had volunteered for a role, but then once they got into the middle of the square, they're kind of like, I don't know what to do. So they would kind of join in and say, let's be it together, or things like that. So they were working together to make it a successful experience and a more positive interaction. And so they didn't just cling to the fear of having it them on the spot and not knowing what to do. So that was a really important aspect of this context. And then all of these things happening together involved with the shared success. Like they achieved the goals of writing these stories and acting these stories out. So they successfully created 7 stories entirely throughout all these sessions and acted out 13 stories as a whole, as a group together. And then there's shared emotional connection. And so like I said, this is a harder one to measure with, I only had 4 weeks to do this intervention. So it's harder to establish a shared history in 4 weeks. But so how I really measured this was how these narratives were extended into their free play times in the mornings. So when they were in the classroom just playing on their own. And this primarily happened in the dramatic play area, naturally. So, but I had brought in different materials to extend these narratives. So as you can see, there's a lot of stuffed mice that were brought into the classroom. There's some prop materials, so like there's mouse ears, bird wings to put on, and things like that. And then I had some art activities that involved symbols or materials that associated with these narratives. And as you can see from these pictures, that they particularly embraced the mouse character through the stories, even though it was only present in the first story. That one they really attached to. So they did it in multiple ways. So here on the side, you can see that they're having a picnic with the mice. This happened on the first session that these were introduced, so they took to it right away. They even created, I didn't get the picture on here, but they created a mouse house out of a cardboard box and carefully, using decorative tape, and made a fancy floors for it and everything. And here in this other picture, they had these little, one of the educators made these little rock mice. So they put little ears and faces on and tails on these rocks to make them mice, and a few other different forms. And so one of the children in the class made gingerbread Play-Doh cookies for them, and they were having fun. And also one, Ethan was he kind of took the narratives beyond what I had introduced, and he was with one mouse. He had this little, particularly when they were having this picnic, he was giving them all names of fictional characters of mice that he knew. So one was Stuart Little and things like that. So he kind of embraced that whole idea and took it and went further with it. So you can see that the ideas of these narratives, they kind of took to them and were using them within their natural play as well. How do I do for time?
Probably wrap up.
Okay. I'll just really quickly wanted to go into how can it be, like, what makes it that narrative is a part of having this community become established, aside from just being an interactive experience. So I'm bringing it back to those 4 ideas of the 4 implications of narrative. So with meaning and interpretation, so because the format of this intervention in these sessions, they were encouraged to be both tellers and authors as well as listeners. So I had really established that being an audience part of this experience was a valid role. So when we were going around choosing who wants to play what, I would say, do you want to play this character or do you want to be an audience member? So sometimes they would choose to be an audience member. And so here they're being both listeners and tellers and actors. So they're able to take multiple meanings and interpretations, and and also through acting out these roles, they're kind of in some way revealing their own interpretation of these narratives as well, with the way that they act out the character. And then with negotiation, this comes out with the narrative control idea that they're negotiating how these stories are being co-authored. They're negotiating who's playing what roles. So in one situation, Ethan, like I said, he wanted to be Tico each time, and so eventually had to say, okay, no, we're gonna let someone else. So he was able to negotiate, and he right away said, okay, well then I'll be this character. And in another part, he was reluctant to be an audience member. He always wanted to be involved in the acting out of these things. So he would also create roles for himself. So if all that was left was being an audience member, he would say, okay, well, I'm going to be the lunch, or I'm going to be the cannonball. Like, he would create a role for himself. So he would negotiate. He didn't want to be an audience member, so he negotiated his way into finding himself a role. And with empathy, because they're playing all these different roles, they're able to kind of get into alternative viewpoints and experience things from a different perspective. And we would also establish that they were also beginning to acknowledge each other's needs. So at one point, one of the children saw that another one was having trouble putting on his costume wings, so he came over and helped him put them on. And so you can see that these things were beginning to happen, that they were beginning to recognize that there was others' needs existing, and not just their own. And with self-identity, they were, like, Ethan apparently really identified with the Tico character, and so you can see that they're beginning to know what characters they were more comfortable playing, and also reaching out into ones that they weren't necessarily found to be more comfortable in. So in Roy's case, where I said he was a little bit more hesitant to take on roles, eventually in the final session, the story came to a halt at one point when a bear character wasn't taken. No one had taken that role yet. And so while he was a little bit off to the side, he all of a sudden began to roar like a bear. And so he embraced his inner bear. Took a little bit more of an assertive role that was a little bit different from his normal choices. And he embraced it and tried it out, and was able to play around with that a little bit. And as well, you can see that because they're extending these narratives within their play, they are exploring them even more in their own ways as they act them out in their free play time as well. So that's what I found. Unfortunately, it was only 4 weeks, so I would have really liked to see what this would have developed into if it had lasted a couple months or a year or something like that. I think that the stories that they came up with would have been a lot more interesting and more personal as well. Because you can see in Vivian Pele's work, as she tells, a lot of her books are more anecdotal, so she'll go through different children that she's encountered and the development progression of their stories that they come up with. So slowly the idea is that they begin to become a little bit more personal, in that they use these times of dictation and acting out to express something that they're either dealing with at home, or if they're dealing with a social situation in the classroom, they bring those into their stories and use that as a way of working with each other and working through these things that as 3-year-olds they're just beginning to figure out. And so I really, really would have liked to see that progression, and I think at some point we'd like to see that happen.
Wow.
Yeah.
When Roy chose to do a role that was less familiar to the other children, they would have expected him to do something different. What was their response?
They went with it. They kept the story going and just said, all right, he's there. Kept going, yeah. There was no shock reaction or anything. We just accepted it.
When you were mentioning the other kids in the classroom, like the 2-year-old and then the 2 francophone children, I was thinking, I mean, we're talking about like groups and communities and forming identity, and it seemed like in some ways they were naturally outside of the kind of community that was being developed. So I wondered if you made any observations on that, or whether that was just kind of outside of the scope of what
Yeah,
you-
well, I mean, personally, I made a few.
Yeah.
I didn't include it into my report, but it's particularly with the twins, the 6-year-olds. At first, they showed their interest, like the group stories that I read out, they actually participated in those a little bit, added a line or two,
Yeah.
with the help of an educator translating stuff for them and such, and kind of going over and encouraging them to participate. But then by the final session, they had decided to go off and read stories on their own and not
Right.
become involved again. So I'm not sure how much of that was their own interest or how much they were just decided that they were too separated from the language to become involved. But at some points you could see their perk of interest, but then just not wanting to involve themselves. So
Yeah.
it would have been interesting to see how that grew if it had continued.
Yeah, yeah, because I mean, you don't want to, but you kind of do want to make that observation of like, take that to a larger scale, and how do different communities form and feel like they're part of something or not part of something, and what are some of those factors that that
Yeah.
create separation, and then how much time does it take for them to be included,
Yeah.
and those kinds of things. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, well, apparently another colleague of mine did her intervention in the same classroom just after, like a month or so after mine, and they were really involved in her
Okay.
intervention. So,
Ah,
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Back early on, you talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the retelling of story.
Yeah.
And I read or heard Thomas King's quote back in September that the truth about stories is that's all we are, which intrigued me initially and has been haunting me ever since. But I think, and you were saying that, what I guess a question, you said they are like starting this process of telling the stories of marginalized groups.
Mhm.
So who do you mean by they?
Well, I refer, like I was more using as an example the blanket exercise that
Yeah.
was established by
Okay.
Cara, how they are taking, like this, the blanket exercise is revolved around the telling of a couple
Yeah.
traditionally Aboriginal stories, and using that to, and they, I think Cara's and I guess MCC did it a few times as well, going to different groups that aren't necessarily involved in Aboriginal work and introducing these narratives to them, and hoping of not allowing these narratives become extinct.
Yeah. So I think, and even in that, in identity and community and narrative, all of that mixed together, that there is a movement, I think, in Canada to retell the stories in order to
Yeah.
reclaim identity. And one of the implications of that, or the consequences, is, you know, for what's now been known as settler culture, as we learn and appreciate the stories, and in a sense almost elevate those stories, prioritize, which is, I think, part of the intention of moving, you know, away from the history as we've known it to a new history.
Right.
But it's interesting to me how much it's almost easier in this day, in this space, to appreciate those stories and prioritize them over our own stories, and even almost to denigrate our own story. You know, I just really, I know it's outside of the childhood stuff, but even
Yeah.
in the as you talked about the movement and the T1 and the T2 and the T2, the stories were more coherent, you know, but we could almost say they're more compliant, like they've learned to stick to a theme.
Yeah.
And is that a thing to celebrate, or, you know, is that limiting creativity? You know, anyway.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like they were eventually getting a little bit more to a traditional narrative structure, but that is just naturally, I think, something that happened because we never, like, it was never established for them saying, we want a cohesive story, we want it to fit this structure. That was just something that somehow naturally came out, so I don't know if that's...
Was it determined, or was it free will?
I don't know.
Great. All right, we better wrap up, but thank you very much.